This is the kind of fearsome weapons that the Saxons had. The battle axe of the Saxons was razor sharp and could cut through a man or a horse with one swipe. It was a dreadful weapon. Now, what was the shield wall like? Well, these are some interpretations of it. It could have been like this, and you can see with the spears sticking out, you wouldn't like to throw yourself against that lot, would you? Or it could have been like this. I personally don't think so, because at this time, most of them didn't have round shields. The Firid did, but not the housecarls. Or it more likely would be like this. And somehow you've got to attack it. So that was the shield wall, which was devastating. Ironically, very few archers, when you consider medieval history of England, where archery was a devastating weapon, at this stage, in the beginning of the medieval history, very few archers were used. In fact, the real men were the ones at the front, holding the shield wall. But if you were not quite strong enough, then you could have your bow and arrow and fire your arrows behind the safety of the shield wall. So they were looked down on and not as strong as the men in the front line. These are the part-time Firid who would be behind the shield wall. Now then, we come to the month of May. Tostig, he can't wait. He's got to get revenge. And suddenly he attacks the Isle of Wight. He rampages along the coast, raping, pillaging, and stealing to pay for his planned attack, until he comes to Sandwich. Now, Sandwich is where King Harold had his ships, and they were there moored up, not knowing that Tostig was on his way. They capture the ships and press gang the sailors who were there to force them to go with them. So these are the raids they carry out from the Isle of Wight all along the south coast. That summer, Harold moves his troops to the Isle of Wight for a period of intense training. Harold allows the Earls Edwin and Morcar to keep their troops in the north, but at this stage, Harold knows nothing about Hardrada's plans. All he knows is that William is threatening him. So now back to Tostig. Tostig captures the ships, 60 in total. So now he's a lot more powerful. And he goes north, heads for the Humber estuary. He wants York. He wants to overwinter in York, because this is his old heritage that he was kicked out of. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls, hear he's coming and are waiting for him in the Humber estuary. Now, if you know anything about the Humber and the River Ouse, they're very fierce currents. So to have ships on those currents that were, what shall we call them, a bit weaker than ours, is very difficult. But they had a battle in the Humber estuary with Edwin, Morcar, and Tostig. And Tostig loses. He has to flee. The sailors are released. And for the first time, the captured sailors can tell the threat from Hardrada. So he flees to the north to his friend in Scotland, the King of Scotland, who is King Malcolm. Never heard of Malcolm? Well, he was the man that was the killer of Macbeth. Another link in all these different stories. So he flees to Scotland for protection. Now King Harold has a dilemma. What's he going to do? He's now learned of Hardrada's planned attack, and he doesn't know whether to combine his forces or split them. If he combines them, they can be in the wrong place when the attack comes. If he splits them, he's got two weak armies. Difficult decision, but he makes a decision and he divides the forces. Morcar and Edwin in the north, and he and his brothers in the south. Kirkwall, the capital of the Orkney Islands, is where the Vikings are assembling, and they are assembling in their thousands. They've already got their ships because they're seafaring Vikings, and they come from all the countries that Hardrada is in charge of. These Viking lands have already given their ships, and they're willingly becoming part of this great fleet. But the Normans don't have the ships. They have to build them, and they're frantically building throughout the summer, June, July, and into August. They are building their ships like mad. What the general people don't understand in modern times is that the Normans were also Vikings. 200 years before this, a man called Rollo came from Norway, and he kept attacking Paris. Year after year, he would attack Paris until the French got fed up and said, look, stop attacking us and we'll give you land in the north of our country. They agreed to this, and that became the Northman's land, or Normandy. So the northern part of France was of Viking origin, and so the ships they were building were Viking longships. Not only had they got to build the ships, they had to equip them with armor, weapons, food, supplies, and for the first time since Roman times, they were going to send cavalry. So somehow horses had to go in an open Viking longship across the channel. Now, you know how timid horses can be. That was quite a risky move, as you'll see. The English weather, whenever you read history, the weather plays its part. Now, William has got his ships ready. It's August, but the weather is terrible. It's a foul, wet month. The wind is from the north, and he's got to sail into the north, so he can't because the wind's in the wrong direction. And he waits several weeks, but he's got to get across the channel because he needs to get there before the autumn and before the winter sets in. So although he's advised not to go, he sets sail. And you can believe it that the horses panic, and they're probably tied to the mast or the sides. And in their panic, they jump over and roll the ships. Many men are lost and many ships are sunk. This is near total disaster before he's even started. Now, King Harold has his spies, and he hears of that disaster. So he therefore thinks, well, that's it. They're not going to come now. I can disband the Firid. Now, the Firid are the part-time territorials. If you don't get your harvest in, you don't eat in the winter. You couldn't nip down to Tesco. And so they send them home. The full-time professionals, the housecarls, they are not sent home, and they all head for London. Now then, a few days later, King Hardrada sets sail with 300 ships and between 10 and 30,000 men. Their estimates, I think more likely 30,000, because this was not a raid, this was an invasion. You imagine 300 Viking ships. And who were the first recipients of this? Scarborough. They were not there for the summer holidays. They were there to attack. The Norman castle wasn't there then, just a Roman lookout. And you see where the houses are, they weren't there except for a Saxon wooden stockade. So imagine how they felt on the 16th of September, when they woke up to see 300 Viking ships with 30,000 warriors. Oh dear. The Vikings thought they'll surrender because there's so many of us, they'll never fight. But they did. They made a fight of it. In fact, the resistance was considerable. And the 200 Saxons put up such a strong fight, it held up the Vikings. Till in the end, the Vikings built bonfires all along the top of that hill, got them blazing, and then rolled them down the hill to set fire to the wooden stockade, which worked, of course. So every man, woman, and child in that stockade was slaughtered as an example to what happened to anyone who dared resist Hardrada. On the 18th of September, the fleet sets sail further south. This time, they go into the Humber, and they're after York. They go into the Humber and then further on into the River Ouse. Now, Tostig, he knows this territory. He knows these waters because it's where his earldom was, and he knows the safe places. And there's a lake off the main river at a place called Recall. He knows that they can moor safely there without fear of the currents. And so he takes the entire fleet to Recall, where the inland lake is. Their intention is to attack York. But this information gets to Earls Edwin and Morcar, and they know they can't protect York. They're not strong enough, but a smaller army can fight a bigger army if they can find somewhere narrow where the bigger army can't get advantage and go around them. And they find such a place at a place called Fulford. It's called the Forgotten Battle, but the Battle of Fulford was the first major battle, not counting the one we've had at the Humber estuary. Earls Edwin and Morcar, they leave York, and the Saxons are yellow here on this map. The Vikings are the purple. Recall is 7 miles away. They get together with the German Beck Brook in the middle. Earl Morcar at the top, Earl Edwin in the south, and he's got the River Ouse one side, and Earl Morcar has got marshes on the top side. Now, Hardrada, as ruthless as we know he was, puts his weakest men in the middle, so that here, when the Saxons attacked, they gave way. The Vikings gave way, which is what he wanted, because that weakened this section here. And by weakening that section, he split the two armies. Now, if you have a 7-foot giant with a battle axe charging at you, you probably would give way. But this is an attack on that weakened center. So now he's split the two armies and surrounded Earl Morcar. Earl Morcar and his army are doomed. Although Earl Morcar escapes, but the army doesn't. Earl Edwin, his brother, beats a fighting retreat back to York, keeping his army intact, but he can't keep York, so he has to abandon York, and he heads south towards the armies of King Harold. We have now one of the greatest military achievements in English history. It's called euphemistically the Long March. But as you will see, it cannot be men walking or marching. They must have used horse. But not only that, they had to take their weapons, their armor, and everything with them. This was a long march. They set out on September the 21st, before they knew about the Battle of Fulford. They'd heard of the attack on Scarborough, but on the same day as the attack on Scarborough, on Fulford, they set marching forth. Now, Harold considers William will not now attack. He thinks it's too late in the campaigning season. So they take the entire army north. Each man had to cover 45 miles a day. That's 180 miles in 4 days. What organizational skills King Howard must have had to organize a military force the size of the English army, not only for supplies and weapons and the movement of materials, but to get them to get all together and to move 45 miles, every man, every day. And they did it in 4 days. The Vikings think that the Saxons are down on the Isle of Wight. They've no idea that they're moving along the Norman North, the Roman Great North Road at such speed, but they did. On September the 25th, Haralda and Tostig, they thought Harold was still on the Isle of Wight, and they'd ordered hostages to be taken from York, and they were to take them to Stamford Bridge. Now, when we say hostages, we mean young boys. The young boys of wealthier citizens of York, probably the boys between the age of 7 and 11 or 12, will be given as hostages over to the Vikings. Can you imagine that? So that's what the meeting was to be about at Stamford Bridge. And the Vikings, well, they'd won the battle. And typical of September weather, it had turned beautiful. It was hot. And these are men from the north who are not quite used to such hot weather. They were sunbathing. They'd been raiding the pubs of the conquered city of York. They were drunk or hungover. And for them, this was holiday time. They'd won the battle at Fulford, and now they were going to stay there and for the whole winter. But they were very surprised when suddenly, what they didn't think was possible, the whole might of King Harold's army appeared. Can you imagine their hearts? Whoa, what's happening here? Half of the Vikings were on the ships several miles away. One of the other sections were one side of the River Ouse, and another section was the other side of the River Ouse. So they were split. They hadn't even got the armor on. They'd been sunbathing and resting. So the 25th of September starts off the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the greatest Viking battle between Saxons and Vikings ever. The housecarls charge the Vikings on the wrong side of the river and kill them very quickly. And now they've got to get across the River Ouse, and there was one bridge and a ford. That bridge was controlled by berserkers. You've probably heard the word berserk. Well, that's where it comes from. Berserkers were drug-fueled maniacs. All they wanted to do was kill and be killed. Their greatest honor was to die in battle. They hadn't lived a proper life if they didn't die in battle. They often were drug frenzied by magic mushrooms and the like, and they were holding the bridge. Later accounts said it was just one man, but that's now rejected. But these berserkers held the bridge, not for long though, because the Saxons overwhelmed them and got over the bridge to where the might of the Viking army was. So the full battle commenced, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Vikings weren't prepared. They tried to form a wedge to break through, but that didn't work. Now they have to send for help because the ships are several miles away. So they send riders to quickly get down to where the ships are holding at Recall. Now, Recall is 12 miles away, and they haven't got many horses. So the army that's at Recall have to start running 12 miles. with heavy weapon, with heavy shields and armor and battle axes and chainmail. Can you imagine it? Many died on the way. Others couldn't carry the armor. Some dropped with exhaustion. But as the remainers got to the battle site, it's just as Tostig are losing. Hardrada is killed, ironically, by one of these weaker soldiers, so-called, by an arrow that goes straight through his throat. So the might of the Viking kingdom is brought down. Tostig himself is killed, and now King Harold has got the greatest victory over Vikings ever. How great? Well, the Vikings came with 300 ships. When they left, there was just enough to fill 24. And here we can see the greatness of King Harold. 2 days later, Harold meets with Hardrada's son, Prince Olaf. Now, he could have got a great ransom for him and the others, but he didn't. He could have kept him in a prison, but he didn't. He could have killed him, but he didn't. He could have killed him and all the remaining Vikings, but he didn't. He could have sold them as slaves, but he didn't. He could have tortured them, but he didn't. And instead, and I know of no other leader at this time that would have done this, especially Duke William, he made them swear never to attack England again, and he let them return home. That is the complete opposite to the violent, ruthless man that was to take control of England. So here we have a true representation of how great King Harold was. His fame would have been greater had he been allowed to live longer. But this shows just what a great man he was. They also got a bounty of weapons left behind by the Vikings. Now let's look at these dates. 8th of September, King Harold disbands the Firth and sends them home. 12th of September, Hardrada sets sail. 18th of September, Hardrada attacks Scarborough. 20th of September, King Harold marches north, which is the same day as the Battle of Fulford. 25th of September is the Battle of Stamford Bridge. 28th of September, Duke William lands in the south coast of England. What a month. What a month by anyone's standard. Everything that could happen, happened.